morning. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak with you today alongside this group of esteemed Low Country scholars. Today I'm going to chat with you about a new project that I'm just getting off the ground that closely relates to my previous research at the Heyward-Washington House on Church Street in very close partnership with the Charleston Museum. And it would be amiss not to give Chad Stewart, the curator of history at the Charleston Museum, a shout out, who will be speaking to you about the Heyward-Washington House in more detail. I do know that Chad is as obsessed with this property as I am. So after this weekend, I know folks in this room are very familiar with the built landscape and material culture of early Charleston. However, I do find that archaeologists kind of come at the question of material culture a little bit differently. It's because it's often garbage by the time it reaches us. Quite literally, discard is the primary means by which artifacts end up in the archaeological record, so we do think about it a little bit differently. Thus, again, given this is just the start of a new scholarly journey, I hope this talk is going to be largely about how archaeology functions as a science to understand social worlds in the past, such as those in Charleston, and how that has led us to this really interesting new research path. Essentially, I want to show you a bit of how the archaeological sausage gets made. However, as I was preparing the slides for this presentation, I realized a little belatedly that this title is a touch misleading. The reason why actually relates to this rather uncharismatic artifact recovered from the Heyward-Washington House property I chose for the title slide that you might not immediately recognize unless you handle a lot of 17th and 18th century archaeological material culture. So this ugly duckling of an artifact is actually what we often colloquially refer to as an onion bottle, reconstructed of several broken fragments excavated in the deepest layers at the Heyward-Washington House. So here's a complete example from an auction house in the bottom left. So green wine-style bottle glass is ubiquitous on archaeological sites in the early modern Atlantic world. And what is dead useful for archaeologists is that bottles are really helpful dating tools. This process of figuring out when someone was living or laboring on the patch of ground where we are digging. So this bottle shape is pretty characteristic of the 17th century and moving into the earliest decades of the 18th century. If you squint, you can see that the bottle seal says 1707. Over time, if you're familiar with bottles, you know that wine-style bottles gradually grow narrower and taller, taking on the shape of the wine bottle we are familiar with today. So I am a historical archaeologist. That means I study the archaeology of the last 500 years or so when the world starts looking more like our own. And we borrow from the tools of historians. So we use documents in conjunction with material culture in order to understand our sites. So why are me and my fellow Charleston historical archaeologists so jazzed by a chunk of an old bottle? It's because it is, in fact, an old bottle, likely coming from the earliest decades of the 18th century. This bottle, among other artifacts, is a little signpost that we are likely finding archaeological evidence of the earliest decades of the city at a property today known as the Heyward-Washington House, a historic house museum owned and operated by the Charleston Museum. So this bottle and other associated artifacts have led me to a new project that I'm going to introduce to you today. My presentation title is misleading because when I'm saying I'm interested in unearthing the 17th century, what I am really referring to is the first 60 or so years of settlement on the Charleston Peninsula, beginning in 1680 and ending, I argue, with a very important fire in 1740. This is an archaeologically and historically distinct period in Charleston's history, one defined by dramatic cultural change and interaction as European, African, and indigenous peoples form new identities in the face of these changing social processes, often with violent consequences for indigenous and African women, men, and children, either forcibly enslaved and brought to this place as part of the wider processes of colonialism or displaced from their home territories. As you might have gathered via your time here in Charleston, this earliest historical period is in fact defined by the existence of a city wall, built out of fear of the Spanish and surrounding indigenous nations beginning in the early 18th century until the walls start to be dismantled around the 1730s, though the seawall lasts up until the American Revolution. The shape of these fortifications that now only exist below ground define the core of the oldest part of the city. but are still discernible in the city streets, sitting below Market Street and above Water Street, which were once creeks and of course still flood as if they are. Even if the walls no longer exist, you can still feel the shape of them in the arrangement of our city streets and how the architecture transforms across the city. Thus, much of the material signatures of this very historically interesting and important period are still palpable in the urban landscape. Despite these, what I like to think of as geographic ghosts of old landscapes, this period has been understudied archaeologically in the city, not for a lack of interest, but merely a lack of opportunity, which is why an onion bottle at the Heyward-Washington house, which is in red on this map, and in the center of the old walled city, is so dang important. So a quick roadmap of the rest of this talk and outlining why the Heyward-Washington house is the centerpiece of this new project, exploring the archaeological remnants of the first 60 years of the city. Again, this talk is as much a story of how archaeology functions as a science as it is a historical one. So we'll begin with an important term in historical archaeology, terminus antiquem, which I describe to my students as date before which, to describe why the first 60 years and not the first 50 or even 30. Then this concept of collections-based archaeology for how we discovered the Heyward-Washington house as a potentially valuable window into the old city. And finally, the concept of mean ceramic dates to highlight where we are seeing the old city and the research wild goose chase it is sending us on. But first, we're going to start with this concept of terminus antiquem and a quick story of what I believe is a very important, historically important fire. So on Tuesday afternoon in 1740, at about 2 o'clock on November 18th, a fire began somewhere on Broad Street in Charlestown, which of course is the city we now know as Charleston. The scale of the destruction from this event at the level of the city was substantial, the scope of which I like to compare to the Great Fire of London in 1666 that triggered a new era of city planning and design in the English metropole. Likewise, in Charleston, historians and scholars credit this event with sweeping away much of the cramped and often irregular medieval 17th century city. New regulations requiring that buildings be constructed of brick rather than timber ushered a new phase of development in the careful symmetry of the Georgian mindset, accompanied by new large public infrastructure projects. But often this is where the discussion of this event ends, as a violent but brief disjuncture in the development of the colonial town. The archival records of this event tell a different story in terms of how this disaster was lived and responded to by the residents of Charleston, reminiscent of the experiences of communities during recent wildfires in California and Hawaii. The fire spread rapidly, consuming a substantial portion of the young city, spreading south from Broad Street and destroying much of its most valuable trade district. It would burn well into the evening, requiring the aid of ships in the harbor who would fire their cannons upon the city to destroy buildings and create fire breaks. The editions of the South Carolina Gazette that follow in late November, December, and January are pretty grim. The governor releases a proclamation asking that residents work together to repair houses of worship and to please stop looting from the burned out structures. And individuals place ads indicating where they can be found since their previous residences are destroyed, or they are calling in debts because they've lost everything and are now struggling to survive. Amidst the petitions for financial aid, in the wake of the fire, in the Journal of the Commons House of Assembly, a petition is read by a gunsmith named John Milner. At the time, Milner served as the public armorer, maintaining and cleaning the government-owned arms used by the local militia. And in the petition, Milner suggests a frightening tale. While the fire raged, Milner and his household, including likely the people he enslaved, focused on removing the government arms to safety while watching his own home and workshop burn. What Milner is describing took place at the town lot, now marked by the address of 87 Church Street and the property name of the Heyward-Washington house. So if you attended the reception last night, you might even have walked directly by it. But if you are a student of architectural and preservation history here in Charleston, you are likely familiar with this property, as it was one of the first preserved in the 1930s historic preservation movement in the city. And it is considered a success story in the sense that they saved the structure from being gutted for its woodwork to be shipped and used elsewhere, which you'll hear more about from Chad in just a bit. This site is named the Heyward-Washington House for the Georgian Townhome Complex, that currently occupies the space. The house and outbuildings were constructed by Thomas Heyward in 1771, who would later go on to serve as a signer of the Declaration of Independence. However, much of the time I choose to refer to this property by its address of 87 Church Street rather than its name, because this occupation is just one of many at this property. Following the Heywards, it would serve briefly as a girls' school, then as an elite residence for the Grimkes, including Sarah Grimke of the famous abolitionist sisters. During the 19th century, it operated as a boarding house and a tenement, and at the end of the century, a bakery, before it was preserved by the Charleston Museum. 87 Church Street and the Heyward-Washington house represents a truly remarkable cross-section of Charleston urban life. However, most of what I am discussing today cannot be visited in the same way the wonderful standing architecture can be. Everything this particular research engages with is entirely below ground and not visible here. It is only accessible archaeologically. Consisting of the time frame where this site held that gunsmith workshop beginning in about 1730, and a likely even earlier residence dating to those first 60 years that we are interested in here. It is the town lot, the land on which it sits, and the archaeological remnants of that earliest landscape that is significant for our story. Thus, going back to the narrative of that 1740 fire, based on that initial newspaper description I showed you at the top, we know that the entire west side of Church Street was destroyed in the fire, including this property. This is where a bit of archaeological science comes in. As important as artifacts are in archaeology, in many ways the layers of soil that we excavate are just as, if not more, important. This is what is known as archaeological context, the location in the ground both horizontally, so spatially this way, and vertically, so how deep it is in the ground. Things are found, and what they are found with, not just artifacts, but soil changes, structures, and what we call features, or pits, wells, posts, privies, and the variety of other evidence of human activity on the landscape. So previous investigations of these soil layers and context at 87 Church Street revealed a wood-framed house with extensive evidence of burning in the southeast corner of the lot, and a thick stratigraphic ash layer that extended west across the property until about midway down the lot, where it dwindles away. So this is a key, what we call archaeological horizon at this site. It essentially seals much of the evidence of this earliest period of life at this Church Street property in place, and life in the city for us to find. This concept in historical archaeology is known as terminus ante quem, or date before which, an event that caps everything beneath it. So in this case, we know everything below this ash layer that you can see in that stratigraphic profile dates to before 2 o'clock in the afternoon on November 18th in 1740. Which means if we are looking for the old city, we know if we go beneath that layer, that is likely where we are going to find it. The knowledge about this very important ash layer and that beneath the current landscape is a gunsmith site is not particularly new. The site has been excavated in 5 different archaeological campaigns, 4 of which were completed by professional archaeologists over the last 50 years. Dr. Elaine Harold conducted by far the most work in the 1970s, Martha Zierden, now curator emeritus at the Charleston Museum, and her team would follow in the early 1990s and 2000s with further work in the stable building, which you can see to the right, as a mitigation project ahead of some construction work within that space. Although I have been working with this site as the primary focus of my work since about 2017, I actually only put shovel to dirt there for the first time in 2023. And that is because most of my work is what we call in the biz collections-based archaeology. Although we have over 50 years of excavation history at this site, our understanding of the significance of this property remains incomplete. Dr. Harold, who did the vast majority of the archaeological work, passed away in 2014 after a prolonged illness, leaving her decades of research unfinished. I came to the collection in 2017 as a PhD student and as a part of Martha Zierden and the Charleston Museum's effort to revisit Dr. Harold's work following her passing, essentially reconstructing the excavation based on what remained of her scientific field paperwork, maps, and artifacts. My dissertation work largely focused on the ceramics, which would allow us to start using the manufacturing dates to give us a foundational chronology of what happened when on the site. So for me, my field work was not an archaeology site, rather a museum storeroom. at the Charleston Museum, piecing together the story of this site like a puzzle using the clues and paperwork, catalog cards, and artifact labels Elaine Harold left behind. And we had some really interesting outcomes of that work that had yet to be fully explored despite the 50 years of previous archaeological research. The first and most obvious of these outcomes is a more nuanced understanding of the gunsmith workshop that operated on site from about 1730 to 1768. Again, the gunsmith operating here served as the public armorer, meaning that he was maintaining the militia firearms, thus was part and parcel of the colonial process in this region. This research also left us with a more nuanced understanding of the significance of this site as a node in a broader network that spanned the American Southeast, not just tied to guns themselves, but to the maintenance of these objects. Any of you who have fired a historic firearm, much less a flintlock, knows that these are technologically complex and often very finicky objects that are prone to breaking. Thus, there is a system of people and places associated with their maintenance throughout colonial frontiers, including John Milner's workshop at 87 Church Street. Another outcome of this research was an understanding of how slavery and enslavement was critical to this network. John Milner enslaved around 11 women, men, and children at this property, including a skilled carpenter, blacksmith, and an individual named Prince, explicitly described as a gunsmith. All the artifacts, including features Elaine Harold identified as the forge and bellows, can be explicitly tied to these men's labor and knowledge, and the labor of enslaved women who did much of the domestic work that this site also required in order to function. If you're familiar with the spiritual and cultural significance of ironworking in West Africa, I increasingly speculate that in particular the work of people like Prince is tied to West and Central African ways of knowing. These stories that emerge from this work are what I believe to be the most important outcome of this research, and I'd be happy to chat more about it during the coffee break. Importantly, skilled enslaved artisans on this site were not just maintaining the militia firearms. One of the more significant artifacts we found was this tiny fragment of a dragon head. This motif is part of what is known as a serpentine side plate, a decorative copper alloy element that would be placed on the side of a weapon explicitly manufactured for trade with indigenous Americans. We know from the documentary record that as public armorer, Milner was charged not just with maintaining militia firearms, but cleaning and repairing the weapons of visiting indigenous delegations. He was paid to repair Native people's firearms, likely to maintain these important trade and political relationships, meaning that even if indigenous people were not physically on site, their guns almost certainly were. There's additional evidence of Native American interaction on the site in the form of the ceramics. Martha Zierden and Ron Anthony have published more on the remarkable diversity of this particular urban assemblage of Native American and colonial wares that occur in high numbers in the pre-1740 contexts. From the lined well, which you can see here as feature 65 right here, 3 near-complete vessels were recovered. 2 Altamaha vessels from the Yemisi, who lived south of the city prior to 1715, and 1 vessel that matches wares recovered in Fusahachie, a lower creek town produced between 1710 and 1730. You might note that those dates are early, way earlier than when we think the Milners are there. There's another nifty bit of archaeological wizardry that tells us when we excavate below that fire layer I talked about a few slides back that we are potentially seeing the old city. So when we work in the historic period in archaeology, we have a pretty good grasp on the calendar years between which certain European ceramics were manufactured. So as you guys know, for example, we know that Wedgwood begins peddling creamware or queensware in the 1760s. So we can use our knowledge of those manufacture spans and our knowledge of context to take the ceramics we find in a certain spot and calculate an average, a center point of the time frame when all of those artifacts likely ended up in the ground. So if you look at this graph, everything on the left is layers of soil beneath that very important fire layer. And these dates along the bottom are that mean ceramic date and another fancy Latin term we call terminus postquem. So if you look at level 8, which based on the manufacture ranges of the ceramics found in the associated soil, that soil likely went into the ground very, very early, well before when the Milners are documented as being on site. So myself and the archaeologist I worked most closely with at the museum, Martha Zierden and I, were already getting suspicious that we had something important going on here. We knew that there was an earlier owner of the lot who received the property as a land grant in 1695, but there's no documentary evidence that this individual actually did anything with that land. Our suspicions were also piqued when we looked at the ceramics with the manufacture dates that were pulling that kind of statistical average down. These were all ceramics that I was familiar with already, but not from Charleston, rather from my time as an undergraduate at St. Mary's College of Maryland, which shares property with historic St. Mary's City, Maryland's Jamestown, and a very early 17th century site. We were also finding early coins, and as we saw with the onion bottle at the top, early glass in these deepest soil layers. So why are we jazzed that we found evidence of these first 60 years in downtown Charleston? There has been some excellent archaeological studies of those first decades of the settlement after 1670 outside of what is today downtown. A variety of plantation sites have been identified to have early components, and the leader on this front has been the work of Nicole Eisenberger at Charlestown Landing up the Ashley River from us, which was the location of the first settlement of Charleston up until about 1680. Andrew Aga has also done some excellent work on the archaeology of the 17th century in the Low Country, in particular the early Enlightenment era agricultural experiments at Charlestown Landing and elsewhere. And there has been some archaeological work conducted downtown that has uncovered sites related to the earliest components of the city. The work of the city-appointed Walled City Task Force has been particularly crucial as they have tracked down the remnants of the old city wall, whether through excavation such as this work at South Adger's Wharf, uncovering one of the remaining redans. So if you head down Trad Street all the way to the end, there's a parking lot right there, and that's where they recovered this redan. And Dr. John Marcoux, coupled with the historic research and leadership of Dr. Nick Butler of Charleston Public Libraries and Catherine Saunders Pepperton of the Powder Magazine, have tracked the path of much of the below-ground remnants of the wall using GPR, ground-penetrating radar. So it's very, very sciencey, and it's kind of all dark magic to me, but the machine that you see Dr. Marcoux pushing right here essentially sends sonar pulses into the ground, and then the machine reads the pulses as they bounce back. And a skilled practitioner using GPR can essentially see if there's archaeological features, things like walls and foundations, without ever actually having to dig them up, which is an awesome way of doing archaeology without disturbing anything. So their work remains crucial as advocates for the remnants of the wall that is frequently encountered in city public works projects. However, these projects are very focused on the wall itself rather than what life was like within the wall. This lack of archaeological research into daily life within the city is, again, not because of a lack of interest. Despite stringent above-ground protections in Charleston, below-ground heritage does not have a municipal protective ordinance. Thus, archaeology sites are continually threatened by developers. Much of the property contained within the boundary of the city wall is also privately owned. Thus, much of the archaeology in this part of the city has been opportunistic. There's a museum-owned protected property that wants some work done, the city has a project they want to complete, or a private homeowner has interest and they contract a trained archaeologist. However, much of these projects have occurred outside of the core of the oldest part of the city, thus would not have evidence of those earliest decades, except for the Heyward-Washington house, which has been protected not just from development but also from pond hunters and privy diggers for almost 100 years, keeping those archaeological soil layers that we are so interested in safe. I am lucky I'm in a position as a faculty member at the College of Charleston, where they're essentially like, do what you want. And the Charleston Museum also has aligning research goals. Thus, like I said, this is a new project, and one of the first steps in this new direction began with a preliminary excavation at the Heyward-Washington house last year. What we are looking for is another archaeology as science sort of point. We knew from revisiting that work from the 1970s, where the earlier archaeologist Elaine Harold found the burned remnants of the gunsmith's house. She was encountering burned joists, ash, and material culture like glass, which as archaeologists to us sounded way cool, and we wanted to see it. So she estimated that the house would have continued beneath the current Heyward house, which has a dirt floor. We were hopeful this meant that we might be able to encounter the remnants of the burned structure within the cellar and maybe even encounter archaeological material from the earlier occupation. So about 3 days before we started this dig, Chad was there, he knows, we actually looked at the field notes, which said that the house was about 3 to 4 feet below ground surface. So you look in the cellar, we're looking out this window with this window well, and the ground surface of the driveway is like about there, and we're like, huh. And so we take a tape measure and we measure down from the ground surface to the bottom of the cellar, and we're like, huh. And we basically knew at that point that the cellar had been dug out and completely wiped out this earlier Milner structure, leaving only a few features behind, but we did learn quite a lot about how the cellar was actually used in the 19th century. So it wasn't all for naught. Although unsuccessful, we still have some outstanding questions. There's archival evidence that the Milners owned not just the current 87 Church Street property, but the lot behind it. If you look at this 1739 map, the mapmaker depicted several what they call dwelling structures within the interior of the lot. Thus, with new interest in the early components of the property, we are headed back with Martha Zierden's successor at the museum, John Fisher. John has run a GPR survey in the back, and you can see he found what's most definitely irrigation lines for the garden, but he's also some anomalies that may be evidence of a structure. So we are conducting a field school with about 12 students this spring to excavate in the garden paths, and we're very excited to run this field school in the spring. Most of archaeological training is done through these summer field schools, which cost students a lot more in tuition dollars and housing because they have to do it over the summer. By doing this field school in the spring as a regular class, we're hoping that they can apply their financial aid and we might get more students at the field school than we normally get. So we're quite excited. My marching orders that I'm very excited about is to identify further potential properties beyond the Heyward house to explore. So pictured on the left is the grand model, which represents the original city plan and the town lots that formed the initial 17th century land grants. As you can see, the scale of this recreation of an original document is kind of screwy compared to what the actual peninsula looks like today. So when you try to slap the maps together, they don't map perfectly. So I'm going through the painstaking process of trying to estimate the boundaries of these original grand model lots based on the modern property boundaries in Geographic Information Systems, or GIS. Once that process is complete, I will be able to match much of the chain of title research that has already been done on these properties to determine which modern lots might still have evidence of the old city deposits. Thus, if you own property in these blocks around Church Street, below Broad Street, or you know someone who does, please tell them to give me a shout. We would love to buzz a GPR in your backyard and maybe dig a hole. Genuinely, please, 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 give me a shout. So in many ways, I and my research collaborators are in a moment of transition from one project to another, and I hope this talk was at least a bit enlightening in terms of how archaeology works as a means for uncovering details about the past that are no longer visible on the landscape. So I'd be delighted to answer any questions during coffee break, but I see you and I will find you. And of course, anything after 1760, I defer to Chad. Once the building exists, I don't know. So, but if you find yourself in Charleston March, please do consider dropping by the Heyward Gardens and seeing what we're up to. But thank you so much.